Great.
Good, good afternoon, everybody. It's now noon. We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes before we actually start. This is my second session. We've already had, before I started teaching, we had one session with Rabbi Ori Regev, who used to be the head of the Israel Religious Action Center, the Reform Movement's social justice arm in Israel, and then the head of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, the International Reform Movement, and now he is the CEO and the founder of Chidush for religious pluralism in Israel. He's a lawyer, very, very smart. We also had Rabbi Josh Weinberg come and talk about the situation with Hamas and Israel. That was the second session. So we really will have 5 sessions altogether. And then throughout the year, if things heat up, we will continue. Last time I talked about I am in the West, but my heart is in the East. So we'll give it 1 more minute. And today we're going to talk about Israel, opportunities and challenges. Someone else is coming in. And when my watch says 12:02, we are going to talk. So I will put everyone on mute. I'm going to do my whole presentation, and then I will open it up for questions. So as we're going, you can either put your questions in the chat so that you don't forget them, and then I promise I will address all the questions after, because I think it's a little easier for me to do the whole presentation and then for me to stop the screen share. Oh, 2 more people are in the waiting room. I'll just oops, I didn't mean to send a message. I think it's easier for me to do the whole presentation and then to stop the screen share and then to do a dialogue and to answer all the questions at once. I do have to stop right at 5 after 1 because I think my next appointment is hang on, let me just look at my calendar. I think my next appointment is at 1:10. So we are going to start. So today, as I said, for those of you who just came on, today we are doing opportunities and challenges. So I'm going to start with one if I turn off my video, for those of you who just came on, it's because when I turn off my video, it will stop my fan from going. We're going to start with one little piece of text from Genesis 12, verses 1 through 4. It's the first time God talks to Abraham. Abraham is 70 years old, and it's the first time we really hear of the land of Israel. God says to Abraham, and that time his name wasn't even Abraham, it was Avram. Vayomer Adonai el Avram, lech lecha me'artzecha. God says to Avram, go forth from your native land, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. If I pause, it's because I'm letting people in. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. And Avram went forth as the Eternal had commanded him. His nephew, I'm adding that, his nephew Lot went with him. Avram was 75 years old when he left Haran. And that is the beginning of the Jewish people's covenantal relationship with God that's connected to the land. So we are a people connected to God, connected to the land of Israel. So we're not going to dwell, if we could do a whole course just on the connection of the people to the land, but this is not what today is about. It's really about the opportunities and challenges. And today is really just an overview. We could spend a whole session on any one of these different opportunities or any one of the different challenges. You could do a whole year or more looking at any one of these in detail. So as you have questions, put them in the chat. And as I said at the beginning, for those of you who just came on, we'll answer some of these questions. We'll answer the questions at the end. And if I don't know the answer, I will let you know that too. And we can I will get you the answer. So, this is not about a little girl doing a marathon, running to the top of a mountain with an Israeli flag. But one of the amazing things about Israel is really about triumph of the human spirit. And I don't think this is a chidush, something that's new to any one of you. We had been displaced from our land over and over again. Israel is a small nation, a tiny, tiny nation about the size of New Jersey, and it's surrounded by people who hated her. From our very beginning as a people, from the time of Abraham, we were always small, always surrounded by people who were bigger than us. And if you look at the Torah text, the Torah is a metaphor. The stories in the Torah are a metaphor for the triumph of the young, the small, the weak, over people who were much bigger or greater or stronger or older than us. In the Torah, in the book of Genesis, it's always the younger who pervades against the older. It's the younger sibling who takes precedence over the older sibling. And in his seminal book, Eros and the Jews, author David and scholar David Biale, B-I-A-L-E, says that is a metaphor for the young nation state of Israel, always triumphing over the much larger nations around us. We might have gotten kicked out of the land, but we still exist. And the nation keeps on going. We come back to our country. We were exiled by King Nebuchadnezzar to Babylonia, but a small remnant of people remained in the land, and we come back. We might have said, by the waters of Babylon I lay down and wept, but we didn't disappear and become just a memory written about in the history books. We might have had people, Arab nations, pounce on us in war, but because we are strong, we kept on going. No matter what, we are there. In World War II, we know we were not in charge of our own country, but it was a refuge in the darkness. And we found a way to get back there. The land was not inhabited. There was no water. We found a way to irrigate a dry land. When Jews were having problems throughout the world, Israel took them in. It's not a big country, not a big place. So Israel, in so many different ways, is really all about triumph of the human spirit. And there's an other side to that too, and we'll get to that when we talk about challenges. But Israel shows that where there's a will, there's a way. And for such a long time, Israel was known as Or LaGoyim, a light to the nations. So that is something that is a model for so many people. If this small nation can be that Or LaGoyim, that light to the nations, and shows how the little tiny people can prevail, and we're still here. We haven't gone the way like of the ancient Romans or the ancient Egyptians who are no longer around. We're still here. We are still around, which is really quite remarkable. Some of these things are not connected, you're going to see. But I just want to show you some of these wonderful ways in which Israel excels, in which, whether it's the people or the land. Israel has excelled above so many others in the areas of high-tech innovation. Israel is known as a startup nation. There was a book called Startup Nation written by a guy named Dan Senor. It's also known as Smart Up Nation, partly because Israel had to have an army. And through its army operations, it developed things like GPS. Through the high influx of the highly trained Russian population, they developed great things through their people. It comes down to that local mindset, mentality, and morals. The country is well accustomed to fighting for its place. There are not a lot of natural resources. It's mostly human resources. People are highly educated. There's a widespread use of English and an attitude that pervades the culture. And the Israelis have a long-standing tradition of turning curses into blessings. And they've worked hard to develop their skills base. And there's a mentality that leans toward accepting risk. They believe that, like Stephen Jobs believed, that if you try something and you fail, that's not a negative, that's a positive, because failure will help you develop something that succeeds. You know that app, the GPS app Waze, was developed in Israel. Intel has its headquarters there. So many of the Hewlett Packard has a headquarters there. They were outstanding in the area of cell phones. If a long time ago, if you had visited Israel a long time ago, you knew that landlines were very difficult to come by. If you had an apartment, you could wait years to get a landline. And then they realized that it was once cell phones became available, it was much easier to have cell phone towers. Israel has much better cell phone access than we do. And kids at very young ages have cell phones because parents need to know how to reach them. Google is very big in Israel, and Israeli software engineers developed something called Google Suggest, which we call autocomplete. That was developed there. They are leaders in the area of high tech. And there are very huge high tech complexes in Israel. And sometimes some of the things that we use were developed there and we don't even know it. They're also innovators in general. One of my dear friends is a member of the kibbutz called Kibbutz Chatzerim in the Negev. And on Kibbutz Chatzerim is a factory. This is their logo, called Nitafim. Nitafim invented drip irrigation. It's a little flat tube that has little things that drip down, so you're not sending water up into the air, which gets wasted, but it really puts the water exactly where the plants are placed. And they sell it through a third-party intermediary to some of the Arab countries that are also in the desert. Kibbutz Chatzerim is one of the few very wealthy kibbutzim in Israel. I'm going to turn off my camera because my fan is going off. And they just sold part of Nitzafim to a German company, so that all of the founders of Kibbutz Chatzerim are now multi-millionaires. It was very innovative. They also, on Kibbutz Chatzerim, grow hohaba. You know, that special kind of aloe plant, and jojoba oil is used in cosmetics and many other things. But Israel is known for many kinds of innovations just like that. This is not about the book Like Dreamers, but Israel is known for their entrepreneurship, and some of their ideas for their entrepreneurial ventures come from the time that people spend in the army. So why do I have a picture of the book Like Dreamers? Yossi Klein Halevi, who wrote the book Like Dreamers, he also wrote the book My Palestinian Neighbors, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbors. Yossi Klein Halevi is a guy who grew up in New York and made Aliyah. If you haven't read this book, Like Dreamers, I highly recommend it. It's the story of the Israeli paratrooper brigade who reunited Jerusalem at the Six-Day War. He takes you through the stories of the different people who made up this paratrooper brigade. Some of them went on to form the ultra-Orthodox settlements in the West Bank. Some of them went on to become these entrepreneurs. Some of them went on to become very famous Israeli singers. Some of them became almost terrorists, fundamental terrorists. But it shows you how the Israeli mindset and aptitude is formed from the time they were growing up until they were adults. But you see how the army helps form them, how society helps form them, and it gives you an idea about culture and society in Israel. And I highly recommend it, but I also recommend getting it in hard copy and not on a Kindle, because you need to keep the names of the players straight. And I was constantly flipping back and forth between the names of the players and what I was reading. And it's an amazing book. But you get to see what the entrepreneurs are like. There's also a movie it's out on a TV series that's out on Netflix, and it's dubbed in English. I think it's called As Angels Fly, or On Wings of Angels. And you get to, and it's about a group that was also together fighting, I think in Lebanon, and you see how they have grown and what became of them too. But Israel is very big on entrepreneurs. There are some very, very wealthy Israelis now because of their entrepreneurship, because of their entrepreneurial ventures. Israel excels in the areas of medicine and science. And some of it comes from what they had to do while they were in the army. This right over here are the Israeli medical teams who are leaving Surfside, Florida, here and here. The Israeli medical first responders go all over the world when there's a medical disaster, even to countries with whom Israel has no relationship. If there is a earthquake, massive flooding, fire, the Israeli first responder disaster team is one of the first disaster teams to fly out. They know how to set up field hospitals like nobody else. They know how to respond to a crisis, and it doesn't matter what the politics are. It doesn't matter if it's their enemy. They are there. IsraAid is an amazing organization, and they are there. When there were refugees from Syria on little rafts going to Lesbos, Greece, IsraAid and the Israeli team was in Greece for more than a year, helping the refugees from Syria to find food, clothing, and shelter, and find a warm place. The medicine in Israel is phenomenal. This is Hadassah Hospital up here. Israel had one of the best COVID responses. It took a while for them to get it right because when they reopened too quickly after their initial response, but they got the vaccine. Ugh, I can't speak. They got the vaccination to everybody so quickly, and now they are getting the booster to everybody who is in need of a booster, people who are high risk. Israel is really on the forefront of medicine. They're on the forefront of skin grafts. They're on the forefront of infertility. Their medicine and their science is like nothing we have seen in the world. The other thing that Israel does that you don't really hear about is they bring people from Jordan and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, Gaza and the West Bank, people with whom they don't have relations. They bring them to their hospitals for treatment. And if people do not have the money to pay for their treatment, they will raise the money. There's a movie that won a lot of awards in one of the Israeli film festival called Precious Life. It's about a young boy from Gaza and his family. They had only been indoctrinated about Israelis and told that all Israelis were evil and wanted to kill them. They had never seen grass before because there's no grass in Israel. And their little baby was in desperate need of medical care. He actually needed a bone marrow transplant. The Israelis brought him to Hadassah Hospital, and they cared for him. They raised money for him to have a bone marrow transplant. And through this exchange, the family understood that what they had been taught in Gaza was not true. And they developed a really different attitude. And even when Gaza was bombed during Operation Cast Lead, they were not afraid. They said, these Israelis are not bad. They are not bad people. They're not going to harm me. They understood that what they were taught was propaganda and lies. Israel is an expert in archaeological excavations, and things are being uncovered all the time. Whether it's at the Southern Wall, whether it's in the Golan, they understand how to navigate what they are excavating and how to preserve it and how to bring tourists in to see what's being uncovered. And if you've never done an archaeological dig, it's slow and tedious, but it's so interesting, and I highly recommend it. I did one while I was in rabbinical school. Military prowess. This is the Iron Dome. I'm going to talk more about this in just a moment. The Iron Dome is able to shoot down missiles that are coming across, and it's the Iron Dome that has enabled Israel to survive all the missile attacks that Hamas sends over from Gaza. And it's the reason that Israelis haven't been flattened. Sometimes the Iron Dome is able to just go ping, 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 ping. And if you can actually download that Red Alert app onto your phone, so you can see anytime a missile is coming over to Israel, and you can see that Iron Dome in action. But Israel has a lot of military prowess and strength, and it is part of the result of the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship. The U.S.-Israel relationship is one of the great opportunities and one of the great strengths of Israel. And the U.S.-Israel relationship is really critical. And this is where you can play a part through our relationships with our congressional leaders. The U.S. Congress provides millions and millions of dollars. There's a memorandum of understanding that gets renewed every year through Congress. And we provide millions and millions of dollars to Israel in aid every year to provide things like funding for the Iron Dome, like funding for their military equipment so that they can protect themselves from things like the missiles and from attacks from the outside. And in order to keep that, you need to write to or call or email your members of Congress to encourage them to keep supporting those kinds of bills and those kinds of expenditures. I don't want to keep harping on that. Israel also has full diplomatic relations, as you well know, with two of its Arab neighbors, Egypt over here on its west, and Jordan over here on its east. After they signed the peace treaties with them in 1979 and 1994, respectively, and in 2020, Israel signed agreements establishing diplomatic relations with 4 of their Arab League countries, Bahrain, which is right over here, right off of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Sudan, and Morocco. They have a secret relationship. They have very close relationship with Saudi Arabia that you don't know about. I mean, maybe you do, but they've had a really good relationship with Saudi Arabia for a very long time. And they have a relationship with Turkey. Turkey is difficult because of the Armenian genocide. And they just reopened, I don't know if you saw about it, read about it in the newspaper, they just reopened a dialogue with Turkey. we're going to talk about Iran in the challenges part, but Iran, look at how huge Iran is. Iran is like this giant towering down over the entire Middle East. And the threat of a nuclear Iran threatens this entire area. And nobody in the Middle East, none of these countries want a nuclear Iran. And so it behooves everybody here to band together against a nuclear Iran. And Saudi Arabia and Israel have a very strong relationship, and they will probably have a memorandum of understanding or some kind of agreement in the near future. Another strength of Israel is that it's a truly democratic country. This is both an opportunity and a challenge, as we shall see. 4 elections in the past 2 years. But because they are a truly democratic country, that enables certain things to happen. Sorry for the noise. They are mowing my grass right outside my window. I apologize. I have no control over that. It's a condo complex. You can see anything in blue is democratic. Anything not in blue is not democratic. But it is a democratic country. And because it's democratic, we are not 100% democratic. When you're democratic, that means every little party gets a say. But they are democratic. But that also poses challenges when there are totalitarian regimes pretending to be democratic all around them. I'm flipping gears now. Israel is quite amazing in the area of the arts and culture, movies and music. You don't realize that some of the things that come to us in the United States really originated in Israel. The TV show Homeland is originally an Israeli show that was redone for an American audience. Fauda is Israeli. Shtisel, we know, is Israeli. It's in Hebrew or Yiddish with English subtitles. There are so many musicians, David Broza, many beautiful Israeli artists and movies. The cultural scene in Israel is phenomenal. The training of Israeli tour guides and travel agents, who so far right now, they're really hurting because Israel is not letting in private tourists. Right now, it's just very special groups, and the tourism is just for people within Israel. Israeli tour guides and travel agents have to go through a very specific 2-year course of study. And you have to be highly trained and highly educated. It's not, you can't decide you want to open your own travel agency. You can't decide you just want to be a tour guide. You have to go through a very specific training program. And for those of you who have been to Israel, you know that the tour guides are phenomenal. This one is really phenomenal. If you went to Israel in the 1970s, the food was disgusting. Even ice cream was gross. It was terrible. Israel is now a culinary capital. It's phenomenal. There are food tours to Israel. The food is amazing. If you are gluten-free, grain-free, vegan, vegetarian, oh my gosh, they far excel us in those areas, in any area. Major chefs come out of Israel. The Israeli chefs Yotam Ottolenghi and Sami Tamimi, who have now made their Sami Tamimi is Palestinian but Israeli Palestinian. He and Yotam Ottolenghi have many restaurants and cookbooks in London. Many Israeli chefs are now in the United States. Zahav and I can't even. My mind has gone blank. But all over the U.S., all over the world, Israeli cuisine is now at its heyday. These are some pictures that I took. I took this picture in the middle. I took this picture here. The other pictures I didn't take. But the cuisine in Israel is phenomenal. The restaurants are phenomenal. There are so many other wonderful things about Israel that we just don't have time to go over. I want to go over some of the challenges because then I also want to give time for questions, and it's already 12:30. So Israel has many challenges worldwide with how it's portrayed by the media. Much of the media portrays Israel in a very negative light. And so much so that there is an agency, whether it's through the Ministry of, through the diplomatic agency or through the government, it's called Hasbara, which literally means to explain, whether through the diplomatic corps, and it's a PR agency to try to put Israel in a much better light. The New York Times, the Boston Globe, so many news stories that we see are very slanted anti-Israel. The Wall Street Journal is one of the few newspapers, and the National Post in Canada, those are the two newspapers that are not as anti-Israel. But when you saw the recent war between Hamas and Israel, it looked like Israel was the provocateur and that Hamas was getting the raw end of the stick. There were some things that were not good from Israel. Israel did some things with Sheikh Jarrah that they shouldn't have done, but it wasn't all negative. Some of the stuff you see are manufactured photos, and Hamas knows how to do that well. And Israel hasn't figured out how to get on top of that PR. So just beware of what you see in the press. And our teenagers today, Jewish teenagers, many of them are anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. Not that it's the Palestinians that's a bad thing, but they don't understand how to look at the press and the PR through nuanced eyes, and how to understand that there's really three sides to every story. What you see in the newspaper, the other side, and somewhere to how to figure out the truth. And the only way that you're going to find the truth is to go to Israel yourself, to meet with people on all sides, to see the nuances and to see that it's not black and white, that there are many, many shades of gray. We're going to look at Hamas. Hamas is a great challenge to Israel. They are a terrorist organization, and their charter is to destroy Israel. Their charter is not to help the Palestinians. They are in it for themselves. These are some pictures of the terror tunnels that they build. They actually will often start inside some of the private homes, and they'll use homes as a backdrop so that when Israel has to bomb them, they're hurting civilians. Hamas does it on purpose. These tunnels are huge. They have electricity. They have communication networks within it. And you see, this Gaza is a very narrow strip, but here are the Israeli towns, Sderot, which has been terrorized by Hamas. These tunnels go from here to here to here. They are so close to the border of all these towns, and often these towns on these border of Gaza, the people in them are not wealthy. They can't afford to move, and they don't want to abandon their homes. The terror tunnels that Hamas builds, we now some of the money that Congress provides is so that Israel Israel now has the ability to build detection equipment to find these terror tunnels and to figure out how to stop them. So this is very bad. So Hamas is a huge challenge. That's on the Gaza Strip. Up north, Hezbollah also has terror tunnels. What you see here are homes on the hillside in Lebanon. And you think it looks like a very beautiful Lebanese town on the hill, but it's a front. The homes have no lights on them. The windows are never lit up. It's actually a front that Hezbollah has made also for terrorist tunnels. Same thing that Hamas has done. And Israel has found many terror tunnels from Lebanon into the Israeli towns up by Metula. And again, the money that the United States has given to Israel for that terror tunnel detection equipment. The terror tunnels look the same as the ones, very similar, huge. They can fit a lot of people, and it's a big challenge to Israel. We talked about the nuclear Iran before. Nuclear Iran is a huge threat, not just to Israel, but to all of the Middle East. And Israel we need the United States, Israel needs the United States to help push against a nuclear Iran, because a nuclear Iran could wipe out all of the Middle East. That is a big challenge. I'm switching gears. Another challenge to Israel is poverty. Jerusalem is one of the poorest cities in the world. It's very, very wealthy, but it's very, very poor. In Jerusalem, you have a huge Muslim Arab population, many children who live in deep poverty. You also have a very ultra-Orthodox population with many kids who also live in deep poverty. It is exceedingly poor. You have, not in Jerusalem, but down in the Negev, you have Bedouin who are very, very poor and live in these, sometimes in metal cattle cars, exceedingly poor. Poverty is an ongoing problem. I'm going to move along. You have a problem of South Sudanese refugees from Darfur, from all over. And there is a problem because they can't become citizens. They get stuck. People do not want them there, and they live in these very sad and difficult living conditions near the old Tel Aviv train stations. And they are very recognizable. They have very bad living conditions. There are a lot of NGOs, non-governmental agencies, trying to work to help them, but it's a big problem, and they are highly discriminated against. You also have Thai workers who Israel brings over to do very menial labor. They're not permitted to learn the language. Their children, when they're born, are not given Israeli citizenship. They also live in pitiful working conditions, unlike Filipino workers. The Filipinos are permitted to become Israeli citizens. It's a very bad condition for Thai workers. And so these are just two examples of some of the difficult situations and challenges that face Israel. The Israel Religious Action Center, the Reform Movement Social Justice Arm, works on behalf of these. There are other social justice agencies that work on behalf of these, and it's very, very difficult and very sad. You have disillusionment of young people going into the army. It used to be a very exciting time in young people's lives to go and do your time. But when you have to go and serve in the West Bank and Gaza, when you have to do things that are not so nice to do, it really affects your mental health. And now it's become very common for either young people to want to leave Israel before their army time, or to go and do a year of traveling around the world after. They'll go to India, they'll go all over, because the army service is not always what people had hoped it would be. But yet it's necessary. On a totally different track, Israel does not have a constitution that guarantees everybody's rights. And because the Orthodox insist that the Torah is the Constitution. Instead, there's a document called the Document of Basic Laws. This is not my field of expertise. New member of Knesset, Rabbi Gilad Kariv, who's also a lawyer and a Reform rabbi, this is his area of expertise. This Document of Basic Laws tries to guarantee that everyone, no matter their ethnic background, their religion, does have their basic rights. But Israel does need a constitution. This has been an ongoing battle for at least 30 years. But the lack of a constitution in Israel is very problematic. And as a result of a lack of a constitution, there's a two-class society in Israel. Now, when I'm talking about Israel, I'm not talking about the West Bank and Gaza. West Bank and Gaza are under the rule of the Palestinian Authority. I'm talking about Israel proper within the Green Line. This here on my right is a city called El Fahim. Al-Fahim is an Israeli Arab city. It's part of something called the Golden Triangle, which is many, many Arab Israeli cities. You notice that it's very densely packed. Israeli Arab cities within Israel that are part of Israel. Arab citizens of Israel carry an Israeli passport. Arab cities within Israel are not allowed to expand out. They're not allowed to grow wider, so they have to only grow up. They do not have proper garbage pickup. Garbage has to only be brought down to a very specific place. So not like you and I, where we can bring our garbage outside the door. They do not have proper education. It's a second-class educational system. They don't have the same educational system as Jewish Israelis. They do not have the same kind of water rights. It's a two-class society. So there's a big problem of civic equality of Israeli Arabs. There are many different organizations trying to ameliorate the problem of civic equality of Israeli Arabs. There's an organization called Sikui for the civic equality of Israeli Arabs, and they have an Israeli Jewish co-director and Israeli Arab co-director. There is many different organizations. One that, the Israel Social Action Center is working on this, but it is a huge issue. There's the problem I didn't mean to do that. There's a problem of the Bedouin, which had a lot of their land taken away. They are a nomadic people. They are shepherds. When they're not allowed to shepherd and they're forced to live in metal cattle cars in the desert, that's not acceptable. There's a problem of East Jerusalem over here. East Jerusalem, I think I must have mentioned this before, is no man's land. It does not belong to the Palestinian Authority, and it doesn't belong to Israel. So the Arab citizens of East Jerusalem do not have an Israeli passport. They do not have a Jordanian passport. They do not have a Palestinian passport. So they are somewhere neither here nor there, and they have a hell of a time. It is a huge conundrum. So Israel has a two-class society, a classless society. It's very, very challenging. We all know that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is ongoing, and we see that all the time. Israel is lucky that they have so much military power, but they also fight that conflict out in the press, and they never win in the press. And I don't have a solution, otherwise I'd win the Nobel Peace Prize. But that is a huge problem. There's an issue of religious pluralism because there is no separation of religion and state. And right now, the Orthodox control religion. This is a picture of women at the wall when they're being told that they can't pray at the wall by the police. And we've talked about that before. I'm just kind of moving through because I want to give time for questions. There's no separation of religion and state, so there are two courts. We have the secular court. This is the Moshe Safdie designed Supreme Court. And then you have rabbinical courts. This is the Rabbinical Court of Tel Aviv. And the religious deal with the issues of conversion, marriage, death. You have to be buried by the Orthodox. So it's very problematic. We have a problem with the political system. Yes, it's great that they're totally democratic, but when you have 4 elections in 2 years, that sometimes paralyzes your religion, your political system. And here, we finally have a democratically elected new government, and hopefully they will be able to succeed. But sometimes when you have a coalition government, so here we have Naftali Bennett here on the left and Yair Lapid from the new government. Hopefully that government will succeed. So with all these, I know I spoke really fast and we didn't go into anything in depth, but hopefully with all of these challenges and with the opportunities, Israel is still quite the amazing country with the ability of the triumph of the human spirit, and it is a country like no other. And if you've been there as many times as I do feel like I go home when I go to Israel. And let me turn on my video. Hang on. And I miss it when I can't go. So now I'm going to open up for questions. I have some When Heroes Fly. That might be the name of the series. So why don't I open it up for questions? And I still have that loud mowing outside my window. I have no idea why they keep mowing. All right. Any comments or questions? You can unmute yourself. We have 15 minutes. Nobody?
I'll offer something, Rabbi.
Thanks.
You mentioned water as an opportunity, particularly drip irrigation and that sort of technological innovation. I I think there's a lot more going on with water conservation, usage, desalination. From a technology standpoint, that's a real opportunity for Israel. I think they're exporting a lot of that stuff even to some of the drought-stricken areas of the U.S. With divvying up different qualities of water for different uses, lesser quality for agriculture, higher quality for human consumption, desalinations. They've made great progress there. So I think over the years we'll find water to be another tremendous opportunity for Israel.
They are, and what I also didn't say is they also have amazing ways to get water from the atmosphere, and do wonderful, wonderful things. And what another thing that they do is they have partnerships with cities across the U.S. And they will, as part of the U.S.-Israel relationship, they will help the United States, different cities in the United States, to develop programs that will help their sister city to utilize some of their own resources that they didn't know that they could utilize, whether it's in fields of agriculture or water or whatever area Israel has expertise. So it's not just the United States helping Israel, but it's Israel helping the United States. And Israel is now helping the United States to develop a form of the Iron Dome, even though that the original Iron Dome went from the United States to Israel. So there is a lot with water. There's a big controversy now with JNF in Israel, from a political perspective because of the settlements in the West Bank, but I don't want to get into that. So there are some people who will support JNF here because JNF here is not involved in that controversy, but they don't want to support Karen Kayemet LeYisrael in Israel. So, there's always politics with everything. But Israel has done, also a leader in hydroponics. They have many hydroponic farms in the south where they use drip irrigation and hydroponics to grow many different kinds of fruits and vegetables. The majority of those are exported to Europe. They sell the best of their stuff to Europe, not to Israel. But that's how they utilize everything.
Just overlaying that, there was a story, I think, on the national news. I think it might have been on NBC Sunday morning about developing wineries in the Negev, despite the excruciating dry heat, both with drip irrigation and with gene modification to grow leaves to shade the grapes.
Yeah. So it's really quite phenomenal, some of the things that they've done. The other thing, and I didn't mention this, at the height of the Syrian war crisis, Israel offered to take in over 100,000 Syrian refugees. I don't think that ever happened, but they knew that it was that the civil war in Syria was one of the worst humanitarian crises since World War II. And Israel felt that it was their moral and ethical duty to do what they could to help. and Syria is one of Israel's enemies, right? But they offered to take in those refugees. The problem still isn't done in Syria. Syria is a huge, huge crisis. And I have friends who actually volunteered in Lesbos, Greece, doing their part to bring supplies and help the refugees. But Israel did step up to the plate. And Israel's not afraid to do that. Who knows if any of their enemies would step up to help them, but Israel has stepped up over and over and over again to help those in crisis every time. Anyone else want to share anything?
Hi, Rabbi, it's Sarah. I'm walking, so my camera's off.
That's
So I
okay.
have, I have some friends who have been upset that the U.S. has given more than $1 billion in aid to Israel, particularly this year. Over $1 billion. Well, it's like 2.5.
It's not over $1 billion.
Oh, okay, because I had read that it was in the
It's
paper,
usually I don't think it's over $1 billion. I used to have the figures, but you know what? I will Google it while you're talking because I know where
okay,
to.
Google it because it's okay. According to the article that I read, and I think it was The Guardian, which of course is very left wing, progressive newspaper, but it's way higher amount than Biden has in his plans to
Well, maybe
regreen the economy. So people are saying, why are we giving Israel more money than we are to build up our own economy and try to mitigate a climate disaster? We're giving more to Israel, especially when you're saying, like, I just need to know how to respond to this, especially when you're saying there are so many millionaires in Israel already because of their expertise in technology. So what is the argument for this?
okay. Give me 1 second,
Sure.
and I am So first of all, I'll tell you what the art before I get you the exact number. A
Okay.
strong So first of all, because Israel, if you looked at that map, right, you saw that Israel was one of the only democratic countries right in the Middle East, right in that center, right? So a strong democratic Israel is beneficial to the United States. It's helps the US to have a very strong Israel in that area. And if Israel becomes weak, it will be a detriment to the safety and security of Americans. So, as Israel's economy and technology prowess continue to grow, both the United States and Israel will benefit further from their wide ranging economic partnership. And both the US and Israel face many common threats, right? The proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the growth of state sponsored terrorism, the spread of Islamic radicalism. So Israel's on the front lines of the Middle East, and they confront those shared enemies, and they are the strongest American ally there. So Israel is the U.S.'s partner in that area, and they are the main partner. Hang on, I have to charge my computer's not charging. Let me just, there we go. And maybe you are right about the billion, but it is Israel and the U.S. have had that memorandum of understanding going back more than 10 years. And it started, I think, with the Obama administration or maybe before. And I'm looking for the exact number. I will have to get you that exact number. Maybe it is over $1 billion. I forget how, it is probably over $1 billion. But it's all for very specific things. I think it's $250 million for the Strategic Partnership Initiative, which is called SPAC, if I'm not mistaken. It's a strategic partnership initiative that helps both the United States and Israel. And that's a mutual initiative. then, or maybe that's a 500 million. I don't want to get my numbers mixed up. But part of it is for the Strategic Partnership Initiative. Part of it is for the military aid. Because if Israel goes down, then it will be really detrimental to the United States as well. And I can get you, I will have to get you these resources later because I don't want to, give
Okay.
you language that's not, and I will send some stuff.
I just looked it up. I think it's $3.3 billion a year under the memorandum of understanding.
Yeah,
Goes back to the days both of the Clinton and Bush 1 administration.
thanks. But I can also get you some material. APAC has really good material on this.
Okay. Okay.
But I can send you the material from APAC's website because APAC is the largest U.S. lobby organization, pro-Israel lobby organization, and they have the best material. So let me see what I can get for you.
Oh, okay. I can get that. I know. I always send them money. I know who they are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, though. Thank you.
Oh,
That was helpful.
Yeah, but it really is about the fact that Israel is the only democratic country there, and that they are the U.S.'s ally. But part of it is this mutual agreement. It's not just the United States helping Israel. Israel does things back for the United States, and it is
That's important.
it's this
Yeah.
mutual agreement, and it's the fact that they need to help work together against this nuclear Iran. When you see that map, you see how huge Iran looms over the Middle East. And I can't stress enough. So when I lived in Toronto, one of my congregants is an expert on the Middle East and on Iran. And this is going back more than maybe 15 years. Even back then, the threat of a nuclear Iran cannot be understated. And that hasn't changed. And it gets more and more critical. And the fact that you're now seeing, the one thing that Trump did was begin to form these alliances with Israel and these other countries, right? With Bahrain and the UAE, Sudan, Morocco, because the threat of a nuclear Iran is going to pull them all together. What does it say? Judith Bales is saying, I seem to be very supportive of AIPAC. Can I explain why they will not criticize Israel no matter what Israel does wrong? Why no support for J Street? So, so AIPAC is bipartisan. Their goal is to raise money for the legislative initiatives, to pass their legislative initiatives. J Street is not bipartisan. That's the difference. J Street has a left-wing liberal agenda. They each serve a purpose, and AIPAC will tell you you can support both J Street and AIPAC. So I'm not here to talk either negatively against J Street or about AIPAC. All I'm saying is that it was due to AIPAC's efforts that the Iron Dome, that Israel was able to get the Iron Dome. J Street has not been able to raise any money for AIPAC, for Israel to support itself through its military funding.
Could I add something there, Rabbi?
Yeah.
My understanding of AIPAC is that its primary mission is to support the U.S.-Israel relationship and promote the U.S.-Israel relationship, irrespective of whatever government may be in power in Israel.
On either side. That's exactly it, Howard. That is Israel. That is exactly what AIPAC's mission is. It's to support the U.S.-Israel relationship, no matter who's in power in the United States or who's in power in Israel. It has nothing to do with Republicans or Democrats or Likud or Labor, and they do that through their legislative agenda. That's how they support the U.S.-Israel relationship. So they don't criticize Israel because they don't feel like it's their place to do that. So I don't want this to be about AIPAC. The only reason I talked about AIPAC because Sarah was talking about how many billions of dollars. That's the only reason I brought it in. Any questions not having to do with, I have 5 more minutes and then I need to get ready for my next meeting. And then the next time we get together, we're taking a totally different turn altogether. Any questions about anything else? Any of the challenges? Any of the other opportunities that have nothing to do with money? Anything else? All right, so the next time we're going to do something a little different altogether. We're going to look at poetry written by Israelis or Jews and poetry written by Palestinians. And I'm not going to tell you who, I'm not going to have the author up on either one. And then I'll tell you after. And we're going to see if you can tell. We're going to look at the relationship to the land through the eyes of the poets. And you're going to see what the feeling is towards the land from Palestinian poets and from Israeli poets. And we'll see if we can come up with something about the connection of the land and the heart. And I think you'll find it really, really interesting. And I'm hoping that people will be able to go to, you'll get to go to Israel soon. You'll get to go visit because that's really the best way to form the connections, no matter what your politics are, no matter where your heart lies. The best way to go is to visit. And if you're a J Street supporter, support J Street. If you're an AIPAC supporter, support AIPAC. And you can support both. This is not a commercial for either one. And, and I really have I don't care what your politics are. I just want you to support Israel and to learn about it. And we have, I think, 1 or 2 students in Israel right now. Amelida Weinman's son is in Israel this summer, which I think is amazing, and I'm so glad he could go. Our Reformed students are in Israel because groups can go, and some of my rabbinic friends are there now. So I hope everybody has a lovely day. And I see I have 2 comments, so I'm going to look. That's great, Sharon, that you hope to go next year. And Howard, thanks for your comments. Thanks, Sarah. For those of you who are interested, TBZ services are in the sanctuary both this Friday and on Saturday morning. The Torah study will be online Saturday morning, but the services will be in the sanctuary. 6 o'clock in the sanctuary and 10:30 in the sanctuary, but Torah study will only be online. So have a wonderful week, and the sun is out. Have a great day. Thanks for participating.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.